And joining me now is our team of reporters, NBC News senior White House correspondent Gabe Gutierrez, NBC News senior national security correspondent Courtney Kube, NBC News senior Homeland Security correspondent Julie Ainsley, and NBC News legal affairs reporter Gary Grumbach. So, Gary, I want to start with you. We woke up this morning to a text from you with this play-by-play of what happened over the weekend. Tell us, break it down for us, what happened and what comes next.
So a lot happened in the past 48 hours. It started on Saturday afternoon when the federal judge blocked the Trump administration from deploying the Oregon National Guard onto the streets of Portland. The Trump administration was not happy with that. They appealed that ruling, and they're asking for the ruling to be overturned. But they didn't just stop there. Then they said, you know what, if we can't send the Oregon National Guard into the streets of Portland, what about California? So they deployed and were militarizing the California National Guard onto the streets of Portland. That's when another court filing came out, and the state of Oregon and California tried to stop that from happening. And then a late night hearing last night, 10 p.m. Eastern, 7 o'clock Pacific, the same Trump-appointed judge said, no, you cannot use any federalized National Guard on the streets of Portland, Oregon.
Quite the play-by-play. And Gabe, moments ago, we heard some pretty fiery rhetoric from Stephen Miller, who, of course, is the top White House advisor. What's been the reaction inside the Trump administration to this judge who we can't say enough was appointed by President Trump to blocking these plans?
Well, Yamiche, you heard it in your introduction, Caroline Leavitt saying that this judge was, quote, untethered to reality. And that's what we've been hearing from White House officials really throughout the day. You just heard from the Deputy Chief of Staff, Stephen Miller. And he says that the White House is considering all other legal options here, although when pressed on that, he wouldn't come out and say exactly what those legal options were, because he says that he didn't want to tip off opposing counsel. But it's clear that the administration plans to fight this. They clearly think that they will win. And what they are trying to argue, Yamiche, is that, look, in certain cities, for example, Washington, D.C., they say local officials ended up being okay with the National Guard coming in. The mayor here in D.C. has at least said that, has not fought the deployment of the National Guard. In Memphis, some local officials as well have been somewhat welcoming. And then the question is, what will happen in Portland, Oregon, and in Chicago, whereas you just heard the governor of Illinois and also officials in Oregon, they are fighting back. But the White House continues to say that they believe they are on firm legal ground here, and they expect to win this in court, Yamiche.
Yeah, and Courtney, as Gabe said, the White House is digging in here. What does it mean, though, to federalize the National Guard, and what can they do and what can't they do while deployed?
Yeah, so if you look at the memo from Secretary Hegseth about these deployments, you'll see the term Title 10 in there. That means federally activated members of the National Guard. In this case, they're not only are they getting paid by the federal government and they get their pay and benefits, but they also are under federal activation, meaning that essentially they're under the authorization and activation of the government. In this case, they're actually under the command and control of U.S. Northern Command. So what does that mean they can do? Now, if we're talking about the Texas National Guard, which was sort of the last chip in this play that Gary just laid out here, Secretary Hegseth authorizing 400 members of the Texas National Guard to go to both Chicago and to Oregon. That was also stopped by the courts. But if we're talking about them, Texas National Guard, when they're on state active duties, have the authority to carry out some law enforcement functions. When they're federalized under Title 10, they lose some of that authority. There's something that we've talked a lot about in recent months, the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878, that essentially says that active duty or federal troops cannot perform law enforcement here in the United States. So if, in fact, these troops end up being deployed to these cities. We've seen it before. We saw Title 10 authorities for the troops in Los Angeles over the summer. They will not be able to do certain things like arrests. What they can do, though, is continue with the mission that we have seen in other cities, including here in Washington, D.C., and that is protecting federal property and federal personnel. And as we have heard from Trump administration officials, the concern in Portland specifically is about ICE, right? About ICE agents, about ICE facilities. So they would be allowed to protect those facilities if, in fact, they are deployed on Title 10. They just cannot carry out other sort of like the more classic things we think of about law enforcement, like arrests.
Yeah. And Julia, of course, going back to this ruling by this judge, what does it mean in practice? And does it mean that the Trump administration can't go to another state? I don't know. And pick a red state maybe where a governor will be more willing to send troops. Does that mean that the president, though, can't go to another state to say, hey, why don't you send your National Guard?
Well, when it comes to Portland, this judge was very clear that the president cannot federalize any National Guard troops to the city of Portland. Now, this is a district judge, meaning that is her jurisdiction. And as we saw clarified by the Supreme Court this summer, federal judges really only have the jurisdiction of their district when it comes to things like issuing these temporary restraining orders like we saw last night. So could that mean that Trump could pick another area of the country where he wants to attempt this again and get a different outcome in courts? Possibly. But of course, they're really focused on sanctuary cities here. And so we could see the same thing like this play out as we are in Illinois. We know a judge already said that Trump could not send National Guard into Chicago, something he wanted to do this summer even before ICE went into that area. He said it was to crack down on crime. Instead, he said he wanted to send 300 members of the National Guard into Illinois. And now we see the Attorney General of Illinois suing over that as well. So a lot of pushback on this issue. And as we saw from Stephen Miller, it appears to be somewhat by design, that they want to call out sanctuary cities for policies that don't allow ICE to cooperate with local law enforcement. Sure, they can still arrest a lot of people. In Chicago, I've got the latest numbers. They've now arrested over 1,000 people in Chicago who are suspected to be illegal immigrants in the country. And then, of course, they're looking at this battle on the legal front and really targeting judges that they think are standing in their way, even if, as you pointed out, they are Trump appointed. So this is all building to a boiling point. The question is, what is that boiling point and how much can they really carry out without National Guard? Well, exactly what they could when it comes to immigration enforcement, because as Courtney pointed out, they're not doing immigration enforcement. It's really a message that gets sent with National Guard so they could be deterred in that fact, but it doesn't keep them from deploying ICE, Border Patrol, any of the DOJ agents to cities around the country to increase immigration arrests. And then if protests ensue, they could try to use that as a justification for why they would want to send in National Guard.
Yeah. And Gabe, Julia just broke down some of the strategy here. What is, based on your reporting, more of the administration's strategy when it comes to these deployments, especially now that they're stalled in court? Are they looking for possibly more workarounds here?
Yeah, look, Yamish, Stephen Miller alluded to this a short time ago when he was speaking here at the White House North Lawn, basically saying that there are legal workarounds that the administration is looking at. He wouldn't detail what they were, but if you just listen to him and how he's responding to questions and how White House officials have been talking over the last several weeks, and really all the way to the president himself. Just, I believe it was last week, the president referred to what was going on in Portland, Oregon as, quote, a hotbed of insurrection. Stephen Miller today repeating the word insurrection over and over again, an all-out insurrection, potentially setting it up for the administration to label this an insurrection and therefore impose the Insurrection Act. That's what we heard Governor J.B. Pritzker refer to as well, that the administration is planning to do. But no firm comment from the White House on what legal avenue they plan to take. But certainly Stephen Miller is teasing some form of imposing the Insurrection Act.
Yeah. And as we think about this strategy, Courtney, if we could zoom out, we've also seen this uptick in rhetoric politicizing the military, of course, an institution you know so well, among members of the Trump administration. How has that affected the way that the military is functioning? And what does it say about how the Trump administration views the military as an institution?
Yeah, we've seen President Trump now headline two very high-profile U.S. military, very public events in less than a week. Of course, there was last week at Quantico when he spoke for more than an hour to the assembled hundreds of generals, admirals, and senior non-commissioned officers, the most senior military officers in the United States military from all over the world. And he gave this hour-plus long rambling speech where he talked about former President Joe Biden using the auto pen. He spoke disparagingly about Democrats, the sorts of things that generally people, especially the most senior members of the military, are not used to sitting through. And the reception really reflected that. You know, the president is used to having a raucous crowd and clapping and cheering. They sat silent throughout the majority of the speech, only clapping politely at the end. But that wasn't it. Yesterday, we saw the president speak to a number of assembled sailors at a celebration of the Navy's birthday. And again, he delivered at times an extremely political speech, something that is not common for members of the military. And what's been remarkable to watch as this has happened, these aren't the first two, they just are the two most recent, and again, very high-profile events. What's been remarkable is to watch how the military has responded to these. There is a tremendous amount of concern about how the military is being increasingly politicized in recent years, not just under the Trump administration, but in the last decade or so. And former officials, former senior military officials are reaching out with a lot of concern about the fact that the president seems to be blurring, and members of his administration really blurring the line and putting these members in the military in uniform in a dangerous position here.
Yeah. And Gary, talking about blurring the lines, we also have seen the administration sort of blur the lines when it comes to the judicial branch here. Julia had something that was really smart, which of course she's always smart. But here's a particularly smart thing she says, which is she said that all of this is coming to a boiling point. Part of that boiling point, when I talk to White House officials, they point to the Supreme Court and say, we think we're going to win there. Can you talk a bit about that and sort of what we might see at the Supreme Court? And of course, it's a busy term. There's a lot on the Supreme Court's plate. What are you looking for?
It is the first Monday of October, which means it is the first day of the Supreme Court's term here. And we've seen a very busy summer with the emergency docket. That's going to continue. But I put what's going to happen on the merits docket here over the next few months into three main categories. One, President Trump's tariffs, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, whether or not the president can use that act to impose dozens and dozens of tariffs on countries all around the world. A lot of the small businesses saying he can't do that. Second, can the president fire whoever he wants? That's a huge question. We've seen the Supreme Court mostly say, yeah, actually he can, but on two different portions. One, the Federal Trade Commission member, and two, the federal board member, Lisa Cook. Can he fire those individuals? Those are going to be heard in oral arguments by the justices of the Supreme Court, and we will get actually a full explanation as to whether or not they think that can happen. And then third, real quick, transgender issues is the third big portion of the Supreme Court's term that I think is going to get a lot of eyeballs here, related to men, women, and athletic sports teams, and related to tomorrow's case, which is a Colorado conversion therapy case, and whether or not counselors can be talking about conversion therapy in their counseling sessions in Colorado.
So that's tariffs, firings, and transgender issues. We will definitely be watching along and definitely wanting to look for more of your reporting. Thank you so much, Gabe, Courtney, Julia, and Gary. Thank you all for your reporting.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.